In a daring social experiment, our billionaire president Donald Trump impersonates a homeless man to see how his own hotel treats a man who looks like a beggar. Before we reveal the shocking denouement, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories like this. Let us know in the comments where you're watching the series from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. The cold wind bit sharply at Donald Trump's face as he shuffled down the bustling street, blending into the sea of people who barely gave him a second glance. Dressed in a tattered coat, scuffed boots, and a knit cap that sagged over his recognizable hair, Trump was utterly unrecognizable. He carried a shabby duffel bag stuffed with crumpled clothes and a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry and homeless. Anything helps." His face, usually the picture of confidence and power, was now weathered with stage makeup to look tired and downtrodden. It was a far cry from the polished billionaire image the world had come to associate with him. But this was no ordinary day for Donald Trump. Today, he had set out on an unusual mission, one that required him to leave his comfort zone and walk in the shoes of someone society often overlooked. He wanted to test the humanity and integrity of the staff at his Trump International Hotel, all while experiencing firsthand how the world treated those who had nothing. As he approached the towering entrance of his luxurious hotel, the sight of the gleaming gold letters spelling out Trump against the polished stone facade felt surreal. He had stood under that very sign countless times, posing for photos and greeting guests as the proud owner of one of the most prestigious hotels in the world. But today, he was just another face in the crowd, an invisible figure to the wealthy patrons who flowed in and out of the grand revolving doors. Trump lingered on the sidewalk for a moment, taking in the stark contrast between the opulence of his hotel and the harshness of the streets he had walked all morning. His hands trembled slightly as he tightened his grip on the duffel bag. He hadn't expected this to feel so real. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and stepped toward the entrance. Immediately, he felt the weight of judgment. A doorman in a crisp navy uniform glanced at him with a raised brow, his eyes darting to the shabby sign tucked under Trump's arm. "Can I help you?" the doorman asked, his tone polite but distant. Trump hesitated for a moment, then adopted a raspy voice to match his disguise. I wanted to see if someone could spare a little food. Maybe some coffee," he said, his voice quivering as he avoided eye contact. The doorman's expression hardened slightly. "This is a private property," he said firmly, gesturing toward the street as though silently directing Trump to leave. But before Trump could turn away, a passing guest, a woman in an expensive fur coat and diamond earrings, stopped and looked at him curiously. "Wait," she said to the doorman, her voice commanding. "Why don't you let him inside? It's freezing out here." The doorman hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Trump, still holding his sign and trying to stay in character, felt his heart pound. This was exactly what he wanted to see, the conflicting reactions, the choices people made when faced with someone who appeared to have nothing. The doorman eventually sighed and stepped aside, allowing Trump to enter the lavish lobby, though not without shooting him a wary glance. As soon as he stepped inside, the warmth of the lobby wrapped around him like a blanket. The gleaming marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and plush furniture were a world away from the biting cold and dirty sidewalks he had just left behind. Trump glanced around, taking in the sight of his hotel from a perspective he had never experienced before. Guests in designer clothes chatted over glasses of champagne, while staff moved gracefully through the room, attending to every need with practiced efficiency. For a moment, Trump felt an odd sense of pride. It was, after all, a stunning hotel. But then he reminded himself why he was here. This wasn't about admiration, it was about discovery. How would his staff treat someone who had nothing to offer but a plea for kindness? Trump shuffled toward the reception desk, his shoulders hunched and his eyes darting nervously as though afraid of being thrown out at any moment. The woman behind the counter, impeccably dressed in a tailored uniform, glanced up and hesitated when she saw him approach. "Good afternoon," she said cautiously, her professional smile faltering slightly. "How can I assist you?" Trump placed his battered duffel bag on the floor and held up his cardboard sign. I don't need much," he said, his voice wavering. Maybe some water or a warm place to sit for a bit. The receptionist's smile froze, and Trump could almost see the wheels turning in her head. Would she dismiss him? Would she call security? Or would she surprise him? Them? The moment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken tension, as Trump braced himself for her response. The receptionist's hesitation was brief, but to Trump it felt like an eternity. Her eyes flickered to the security guard standing a few feet away, then back to him. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a private establishment. Our lounge is reserved for guests," she said, her tone polite but firm. Trump nodded slowly, pretending to accept the response, but before he could turn away, a younger staff member passing by overheard the exchange. The young man, dressed in the same polished uniform as the receptionist, paused. "Wait," he said softly, stepping closer. "It's freezing outside. Maybe we can let him sit in the corner for a bit. I can bring him some water." The receptionist looked visibly uncomfortable, glancing at the man as though he had broken an unspoken rule. Trump watched the interaction closely, noting the subtle power dynamics at play. The receptionist pursed her lips, clearly reluctant but unwilling to argue in front of a guest-filled lobby. "Fine," she said tersely, "but make it quick." The young staffer smiled at Trump, his kindness genuine. "Come with me, sir," he said, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the lobby, away from the bustling check-in area. Trump followed him, his boots scuffing the polished floors, drawing a few disapproving stares from nearby guests. He could feel the weight of their judgment in every step, and for the first time, he fully understood what it was like to be looked at as though you didn't belong. The young staff member pulled out a chair at a small table near the back of the lobby. "Here you go," he said warmly. "I'll grab you some water. Do you need anything else?" Trump shook his head, keeping his voice low. "No, thank you. This is more than enough." As the young man walked away, Trump settled into the chair, taking in the room around him. From this vantage point, he could observe everything: the way the staff moved, the way guests interacted, and, most importantly, the way people reacted to his presence. A well-dressed couple at a nearby table shot him a curious glance, whispering to each other and frowning slightly. A man in a tailored suit walked past and deliberately avoided looking in his direction, but not everyone was unkind. A child sitting with his parents waved at Trump, his innocent smile cutting through the tension. Trump waved back, his heart warming slightly at the simple gesture. The young staffer returned with a glass of water and set it on the table with a small plate of cookies. "I thought you might be hungry," he said with a kind smile. Trump looked up at him, genuinely moved by the gesture. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. The young man nodded, then hesitated. "You know," he said, lowering his voice, "I've seen a lot of people come through these doors, but not everyone gets treated fairly. If you need anything, just let me know." Trump nodded again, unable to fully express his gratitude without breaking character. As he sat there, sipping the water and nibbling on the cookies, Trump noticed a change in the atmosphere. The other staff members seemed to be avoiding his corner of the room, their glances quick and fleeting. A manager in a sharp suit approached the receptionist, who gestured discreetly toward Trump. The manager frowned and began walking in his direction. Trump tensed, bracing himself for a confrontation. The manager stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "Sir," he began, his tone clipped, "is there something we can assist you with? Are you a guest at the hotel?" Trump shook his head, keeping his voice low and humble. "No, I'm not a guest. I just needed a place to warm up for a little while. I'll leave if it's a problem." The manager studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You're welcome to stay for a short time," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't thrilled about it. "But please don't disturb our guests." Trump nodded, grateful for the reprieve, but he couldn't help noticing the tension in the manager's demeanor. It was clear that his presence was making people uncomfortable, and that realization stung in a way he hadn't anticipated. As the manager walked away, Trump leaned back in his chair, reflecting on everything he had seen so far. The contrast between the young staffer's kindness and the cautious, cold reactions of the others was stark. He had always prided himself on running a world-class establishment, but now he wondered, was his hotel truly a place of luxury and inclusion, or had it become a symbol of exclusivity, shutting out those who didn't fit the mold? The thought lingered in his mind, heavier than he expected, as he prepared for what the rest of the day might reveal. Donald Trump remained seated in the corner of the grand lobby, the tension in the air growing more palpable with each passing moment. The stares from the guests and the staff became harder to ignore, and Trump, still disguised as a homeless man, began to feel the full weight of their silent judgment. A well-dressed couple at a nearby table whispered to one another, occasionally glancing in his direction before shaking their heads disapprovingly. A businessman, carrying an expensive leather briefcase, made a point of walking to the other side of the lobby, his nose wrinkled, as if the very presence of someone like Trump offended him. For the first time in years, Trump felt invisible, not as the larger-than-life figure he was known to be, but as someone society deemed unworthy of notice or respect. As he sat there, reflecting on the stark contrasts in human behavior, the young staffer who had helped him earlier returned with a quiet determination. This time, he carried a tray with a steaming cup of coffee and a small sandwich. "I thought you might need something more substantial," he said, setting the tray down in front of Trump. His voice was calm, but there was a subtle defiance in his demeanor, as though he knew others might disapprove of his actions but didn't care. Trump looked up at him, his eyes softening. "Thank you," he said sincerely, his voice still disguised but tinged with genuine emotion. The staffer hesitated for a moment, then sat down across from him. "If you don't mind me asking," he said carefully, "how did you end up here? I mean, in this situation?" Trump paused, caught off guard by the question. He realized he needed to think quickly to stay in character. "Life hasn't been kind lately," he said, his voice low and gravely. "Lost my job. Lost everything, really. Just trying to get by." The staffer nodded, his expression compassionate. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said. "It's tough out there, but you're not alone. There are still people who care." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the hotel's manager, who had clearly been watching from a distance. The manager's polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor as he approached, his expression a mix of professionalism and disapproval. "Excuse me," he said, his voice clipped, "but I need a word with you, Alex." He gestured for the young staffer to step aside, and Alex reluctantly obeyed. Trump watched as the manager pulled him aside, speaking in hushed but firm tones. Although Trump couldn't hear the exact words, it was clear the manager was reprimanding Alex for his act of kindness. Alex nodded silently, his shoulders tense, before returning to Trump's table. "I'm sorry," Alex said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "I have to get back to work, but if you need anything, just let me know." Trump nodded, his respect for the young man growing by the minute. As Alex walked away, Trump noticed the subtle glares from the other staff members. It was as if they were torn between their instincts to be helpful and their fear of stepping out of line. The weight of this realization settled heavily on Trump. How many of these employees had been trained to prioritize appearances over genuine care? The lobby began to grow busier as the evening approached, and Trump's presence became even harder to ignore. A few guests whispered complaints to the reception staff, their discontent evident in their gestures. One man, dressed in an impeccable suit, marched up to the front desk and loudly demanded, "Why is that man still here? This is supposed to be a 5-star hotel, not a shelter." Trump overheard the comment, and for a brief moment his pride flared. It took every ounce of restraint to stay in character and not reveal his true identity. Just as things seemed to be reaching a breaking point, a woman entered the lobby with 2 young children. She was elegantly dressed, but had an air of warmth and humility about her. Spotting Trump in the corner, she hesitated for a moment before walking over to him. "Hello," she said gently, crouching down to meet his eye level. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" Her voice was soft, and her children peered curiously at him from behind her. Trump blinked, surprised by her kindness. "I'm fine," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Just needed a warm place to sit for a bit." The woman smiled kindly and reached into her purse, pulling out a few bills. "Here," she said, handing them to him. "I hope this helps, even if it's just a little." Trump hesitated, his heart swelling with gratitude, but also a pang of guilt. He wasn't truly homeless after all, and accepting her money felt wrong. But he nodded, taking the bills with trembling hands. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As she walked away, Trump sat in silence, staring at the bills in his hand. The acts of kindness he had witnessed, Alex's defiance, the woman's generosity, stood in stark contrast to the judgment and coldness he had also experienced. For the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of clarity. This experiment was more than just a test of his hotel's staff, it was a test of humanity itself. And the results were proving to be as complex as they were eye-opening. The hours crept by, and Donald Trump remained in his corner of the Trump International Hotel lobby, silently observing the ebb and flow of humanity around him. By now, most of the staff were aware of his presence, and their reactions continued to vary. Some avoided his gaze entirely, pretending he didn't exist, while others threw occasional suspicious glances his way, as if waiting for him to cause trouble. The guests, on the other hand, were less discreet. A man in a tailored suit openly scoffed as he passed, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable. What's next? Letting anyone off the street into places like this?" Trump heard him clearly, but stayed silent, keeping his act intact. He wanted to see how far people's biases and assumptions would go when faced with someone they believed was beneath them. Despite the negativity from some, Trump also noticed small acts of kindness that stood out like beacons in the otherwise chilly atmosphere. One of the housekeepers, an older woman with tired eyes and a warm smile, walked past him on her way to another task. She paused briefly, looked at him, and without saying a word, placed a neatly folded napkin on the table beside him. It wasn't much, but the gesture felt profoundly human, an acknowledgement of his existence in a space where most seemed eager to ignore him. Trump nodded in silent gratitude, touched by the small but meaningful act. As the evening progressed, the manager returned, his expression tight and his patience clearly wearing thin. "Sir," he said curtly, standing over Trump with an air of authority, "I understand it's been a difficult day for you. But this is a business establishment. If you're not a guest, I'm going to have to ask you to leave soon." Trump looked up at him, his face carefully neutral. "I understand," he said softly, making no move to get up. The manager lingered for a moment, clearly expecting more of a reaction, but when none came, he sighed heavily and walked away, muttering something under his breath. The interaction left a sour taste in Trump's mouth, but before he could dwell on it, Alex, the young staffer who had shown him kindness earlier, appeared again. This time he was more cautious, glancing over his shoulder as if ensuring no one was watching. "I brought you something," he whispered, placing a small takeout container on the table. Inside was a warm meal, nothing fancy, but it smelled delicious and comforting. Trump looked up at him, genuinely moved. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alex smiled faintly. "Don't mention it. Just try not to stay too long. The manager's been on edge all evening." Trump nodded, understanding the risk Alex was taking by helping him. As the young man walked away, Trump opened the container and began eating, each bite filling him with a strange mix of gratitude and sadness. He had never truly understood what it meant to be dependent on the kindness of others, and the experience was humbling in a way he hadn't expected. For years, he had been at the top of the world, commanding respect and wielding influence wherever he went. But now, sitting in his own hotel, disguised as a homeless man, he saw the world through a completely different lens, one that exposed both its cruelty and its compassion. Just as he finished his meal, an unexpected commotion near the entrance caught his attention. A man dressed in ragged clothing, much like Trump's disguise, had stumbled into the lobby. He was clearly disoriented, mumbling incoherently as he tried to steady himself against a marble column. The guests recoiled, their faces a mix of disgust and fear, and the staff sprang into action, rushing to escort the man out. Trump watched intently, his heart racing. This was a real homeless man, someone who lived the life Trump was merely pretending to understand. The security guard reached the man first, his tone firm but not unkind. "Sir, you can't be here. Let me help you back outside." The man resisted, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. A few guests murmured in disapproval, one woman even exclaiming, "This is ridiculous. Where's the management?" Trump felt a surge of anger rise within him. He wanted to intervene, but he knew he couldn't break character, not yet. Instead, he observed closely, noting every detail of how the situation unfolded. To his surprise, it was Alex who stepped forward once again, his expression calm but resolute. "Let me handle this," he said to the security guard, who hesitated before stepping aside. Alex approached the man, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice. "Hey, it's okay," he said gently. "Let's get you somewhere safe." The man looked at him with bleary eyes, his resistance fading as Alex guided him back toward the entrance. Trump watched, his respect for the young staffer growing with every passing second. As Alex helped the man outside, Trump felt a pang of guilt. He had orchestrated this entire experiment to test the integrity of his staff and guests. But now he realized that the real heroes were the ones who acted with kindness and compassion, regardless of the circumstances. This wasn't about him or his hotel. It was about the people who chose to do the right thing, even when no one was watching. And in that moment, Trump knew that his experiment was teaching him far more than he had anticipated. As the evening turned into night, Donald Trump remained seated in his quiet corner of the Trump International Hotel lobby, his mind racing with the events of the day. The reactions of the staff, the guests, and even strangers passing by had painted a vivid picture of humanity's complexity. Kindness and cruelty, empathy and indifference, they had all been on display. He had come into this experiment expecting to test the values of his own establishment, but now he realized the lessons went far beyond the walls of his hotel. It wasn't long before Alex returned to the lobby, having successfully guided the real homeless man to a safer space. His uniform was slightly rumpled, and there was a tired but resolute look in his eyes. Trump watched as Alex returned to his duties, the young man's compassion shining brightly against the backdrop of an otherwise rigid, rules-driven environment. Trump knew that Alex's actions had risked reprimand, perhaps even termination. But it was clear the young man valued doing the right thing over the fear of consequences. The lobby began to quiet as the last few guests trickled in for the night. Trump observed the staff meticulously preparing for the next day, their polished movements a testament to their training. Yet he couldn't shake the nagging question that had been building in his mind all day. Was this the kind of culture he wanted his hotel to represent? One where appearances and protocol were prioritized over genuine human connection? Just as he was preparing to leave, the manager approached him once more, his expression unreadable. "Sir," he began, his tone polite but firm, "it's late, and I must insist that you leave the premises. We've allowed you to stay longer than usual, but this is a private property." Trump nodded, rising slowly to his feet. He didn't argue or protest. He had seen enough. As he adjusted the tattered coat he wore as part of his disguise, he turned to the manager and said, "Thank you for allowing me to stay as long as you did. I appreciate it." The manager seemed momentarily taken aback by Trump's calm demeanor, but quickly regained his composure. "Of course," he said briskly. "Take care." Trump made his way toward the exit, his steps deliberate and slow. He paused briefly at the door, taking one last look at the opulent lobby, the gleaming chandeliers, and the people within it. This place, his place, had shown him both the best and the worst of human nature in just a single day. Outside, the cold night air hit him like a wave, but he welcomed it. As he walked down the dimly lit street, he removed the disguise piece by piece, the worn coat, the scruffy hat, and finally, the fake facial hair. Beneath it all was the man everyone recognized, yet tonight, he felt like a different person entirely. This experiment had stripped away not just his physical appearance, but also the layers of power and privilege that had insulated him for so long. The next morning, Donald Trump arrived at the Trump International Hotel as himself. The staff, now back in their polished routines, greeted him with the deference he was accustomed to. But there was one person he sought out above all others. He found Alex in the staff lounge, tidying up after a coffee break. When Alex saw Trump enter, his eyes widened in shock, recognizing the face he had only seen on television and in headlines. "Mr. Trump?" Alex stammered, clearly confused. What are you doing here?" Trump smiled, his expression warm but serious. "I wanted to thank you," he said simply, "for everything you did yesterday." Alex blinked, the realization dawning on him. "Wait, that was you? You were the—" His voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Trump nodded. "Yes, that was me, and I saw everything. The way you treated me, the way you treated that man last night, it showed me the kind of person you are, and it reminded me of the kind of values this hotel should stand for. Alex looked down, unsure of what to say. "I was just doing what I thought was right," he murmured. Trump placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice firm but kind. "And that's exactly why people like you are so important. You didn't just follow the rules, you followed your heart. That's what this place needs, people who care." In the days that followed, Trump made sweeping changes to the policies of his hotel. He implemented new training programs that emphasized empathy and compassion, ensuring that all staff understood the importance of treating every individual with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. He also set up partnerships with local shelters and charities, dedicating resources to help those in need. For Trump, the experience had been more than just an experiment. It had been a revelation. And while his disguise had allowed him to see the world through a different lens, it was the actions of people like Alex that truly opened his eyes. The young staffer's courage and kindness had sparked a change not just in the hotel, but in Trump himself. As the weeks went by, the Trump International Hotel began to develop a new reputation, not just as a symbol of luxury, but as a place where humanity and compassion were at the forefront. And for the first time in a long while, Donald Trump felt a sense of pride that had nothing to do with power or wealth. It was the pride of knowing that his name and his legacy could stand for something greater.